Thanks everybody for coming to the second lecture of this fall's lecture series entitled Decolonizing Design. I'm really excited to introduce Chris Cornelius. He is a registered member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and an associate professor of architecture at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His research and practice focus on the architectural translation of culture with a particular focus on the American Indian culture. He is a founding principal of Studio Indigenous, a design and consulting practice serving American Indian clients. I think it's really fantastic to have Chris here because his research is both very critical in its position towards representation, and it's both a practice that's looking at making built interventions. So we all know our kind of mission statement that we have at the school, but I think what Chris is doing in his own practice and in his own research is really getting at what we're talking about doing at the school. He's received numerous awards and honors from, among others, the National Museum of the American Indian, the Smithsonian Institute, the AIA. Most recently, he was named one of the inaugural recipients of the 2016-17 Miller Prize, which I know he's going to show. And with that, I think we can get going, and I'll hand it over to Chris, but please join me in welcoming him.
Jacob, for the invitation here to speak and to share my work with all of you. What kufnawela du Chris Nyun gets, akwahoni wagita loda, okale ontiata aka, nawagadahun choda. I extend my greetings, love, and thankfulness to all of you. I am Chris Cornelius. I'm of the Wolf Clan, and People of the Standing Stone is the earth that I come from. So I started to think about the issues of dealing with Native American architecture and indigenous thinking when shortly after I learned about this in architecture school, Venturi's duck and decorated shed, right? Well, we know this piece of architectural history criticism where the building is the signage, i.e. the duck, or it has signage applied to it. And to me, there was a parallel to what was happening for Native Americans in contemporary architecture. That is, buildings like this, which I call the zoomorph, which this particular building is the elementary school on my reservation. It's a turtle. There are a number of buildings like this. They're turtles, they're bear paws, or thunderbirds from the sky. So they have these kind of zoomorphic forms. The other, which I call the pictograph, is a sort of normative type of building that has native imagery assigned to it or applied to it, and pattern work that comes from wampum belts or other artwork, and either of those don't particularly make it native because it doesn't really talk about what are the cultural underpinnings of those things, right? The images, the forms, and where they actually come from. So as a graduate student at the University of Virginia, I started to really think about these issues and how was I going to practice going forward, and how did I want to contribute to the discipline and to my culture. When we see places like this in the landscape, like Bear Lodge Butte, we know that they have stories attached to them. So the native people or indigenous people would associate a story with things that are physically in the landscape as ways to begin to explain why they exist and how they exist the way that they do. And so in this particular place, this story where three young women were being chased by a bear, they jumped onto a tree stump and the stump started to grow and the bear started to claw at it, all of which explains the physical landscape that we see. And this is part of the indigenous way of thinking that I think that architecture can participate in that, right? If we begin to think about how the stories get told and how they get, how the culture gets perpetuated is really through the oral tradition, and architecture can participate in that, and in that particular way of thinking that buildings should fit into the landscape similar to geological or geomorphic events like this. So the first project I'd like to share with you is a maple sugar camp that I did for my own tribe on our reservation. It was a small building that is basically just used to boil the sap down to make maple sugar. And maple sugaring is part of our culture. It's how we naturally sweeten food, and there are cultural sort of rituals that go along with that as well. So this is a structure. One of the things that they wanted me to use was this cordwood construction. The cordwood is not really an indigenous building type. It's really just a building way of building that creates a kind of super insulated wall where you actually use logs. You use a 10-inch log on the inside, 4 inches of insulation, and a 10-inch log on the outside, and those are fill in the frame with mortar. So in an unconditioned space, and when you have this kind of super insulated wall, it makes a more comfortable space. And so the particular project was mostly for the elementary school, the turtle school, the image that I just showed. Teachers teach students how to do this practice of boiling down the sap to make the syrup. And in the conversations with the teacher that was teaching this, she started to talk about how the Oneida stories, we had a lot of stories about the sky and particularly about the stars, and how those things eventually kind of got lost. And so we started to talk about this story about the 7 dancers, or the Pleiades. And in the story, there are 7 young children who want to have their own sort of feast ceremony. They go to their parents to ask them to give them some food for their feast. The parents refuse, and so the children get angry. They start dancing because they're so angry. They dance so hard they go into the sky. And so when we see the Pleiades, or the 7 dancers, we say, when they're flickering on and off, we say that they're dancing really hard. It also is a signal of our midwinter ceremony, so when the Pleiades are directly overhead, we know when that ceremony takes place. And so I began to think about that story and how you could use the architecture to begin to tell that story. And the practice of boiling the sap, which has to go from the ratio is like 40 to 1, 40 gallons of sap for 1 gallon of syrup, lets off a lot of steam, and so there was a ventilation sort of requirement. And so I started to think, well, could I use this ventilation cone as a way of talking about the aperture through which these children may have danced into the sky, so that you can actually use the building to tell the stories, so that you begin to have the students participate in the ritual, participate in the space, and to begin to learn more about their own culture. And so the ventilation cone is that sort of metaphorical space, but it's also the practical sort of ventilation, as well as an aperture that allows you to see when the Pleiades are directly overhead, to use it throughout the year in that way. This is the interior render of the space, and the ventilation cone that kind of goes through the roof of the space. So I was asked to be a cultural consultant and kind of became a collaborating designer with Antoine Predock, who was hired to design a school in Milwaukee, the Indian Community School of Milwaukee, which is a private school. It's a K-4 through 8 school, which was started by 3 mothers in the late 60s, early 70s. So the American Indian movement, which you may know something about, was basically kind of based here in Minneapolis. During that time, they occupied federal properties, and I'll talk about this in another project as well. But the short version of the story is that these 3 mothers were unhappy with how the history of Native Americans was being taught in school, so they pulled their students out of the public schools and started their own school. Basically started in a church basement, then went to the U.S. Coast Guard station in Milwaukee, which was a federal property that was abandoned. And then they started the school. So it has a very long history. And then in the year 2000, they bought nearly 200 acres just south of Milwaukee, and decided to build a new campus. And so I was a part of that process. I was hired in 2003, shortly after Antoine Predock was hired, through an invited competition. So one of the first things I did with Antoine was to take him on visits to our reservations in Wisconsin, and so that he got an understanding of how Most of these cultures are eastern woodland cultures. Great Lakes, eastern woodland have some similarities. So some of these images are from the Menominee Reservation, just northwest of Green Bay. I took him to my reservation, the Oneida, which is just west, adjacent to Green Bay. And then the images on the bottom row here are of the site itself, and students participated in our design process in different ways. We asked them to draw the things that they liked on the site. We would give them cameras to photograph the things that they found interesting, and this image here of Antoine going through the woods with the students. So we began to think about what it is we were doing. So we're designing a place for the 11 tribes of Wisconsin, not any particular tribe group or cultural grouping. And I explained to him that the culture is really a series of reciprocities. It can't be easily delaminated, and you can't kind of see it in a cause and effect sort of way and manner, that these things have a very intricate sort of network. And so we created these graphics to begin to demonstrate that. So we started to look at cultural values instead of very specific things with the tribes. And so you can see some things here that are branches of other things, ceremonies, the sweat lodge. The school has an opening closing ceremony, the role of play and how that is integrated into the culture. And so we created these graphic translations of those cultural values. This one is dance. This one is about the cycles and reciprocity of the moon. And so when we did these, we printed them on 3-foot by 4-foot transparency. And when we presented them to the community and to the client, the school, we would pin them up on a light box and talk about each one of these cultural values and how we thought that they would be integral to the project, so that they began to understand that we understood that the culture was one that could be overlaid with one another in different ways. And so those kinds of groupings started to inform the program. They started to inform the way that we talked about the building. So for instance, we wanted to disassociate any of these sort of institutional titles that are in schools with the project that we were working on. So we never called the place that they eat the cafeteria. We never called it the theater, or we never called it the lobby. We started to call the main entry community. We called the theater drum. We call the place that they eat feast. We call the stair that goes from the elementary school grades to the middle school grades to earth to sky, because we thought of it as a kind of rite of passage. And so these are some of the cultural laminates that are overlaying the plan of the building. It started to inform the way that we talked about the building and the way that we thought about these particular spaces. So as we began to examine the building program, we started to combine certain cultural laminates with one another in order to make a bigger, greater understanding of that. So this is the building. It's just over 160,000 square feet. It's the building, the school itself is a center of community. It's also a nonprofit corporation because it is a private school. So all of those things are kind of housed within the campus. Antoine and I like to talk about the building inhabiting the site as if it were an animal. So it has to kind of negotiate a elevation difference between about 8 feet from the entry, which is in the middle, the main entry in the middle here, to these other elementary grades at this lower level. Surrounded by wetlands. It's a former sort of farm field in southeast Wisconsin. But the school owns close to 200 acres around the school to help keep other development away from the campus. So we tried to use materials that came from the earth. Most of it is stone, wood, copper, those kinds of things that come out of the earth and have some significance to the people there. The student entrance we call migration, so students are coming in and out of the building every day and in this area and zone. This is the second floor. The second floor is more about the sky, so the roof kind of pulls apart as if the sky were fracturing apart and clouds were letting light in, allowing and accommodating these clear stories to let a lot of natural light in. And you'll also see the tree columns here. The trees came from the Menominee Forest in Wisconsin. So if you look at a satellite photo of Wisconsin, and if you know where Green Bay is, and you look just to the northwest, you'll see this rectangle of very dense green. It almost looks like it was photoshopped onto the photograph. That dense green is the Menominee Reservation. The Menominee have been sustainably harvesting their entire existence, and so they had one of the first FSC certified forests. I think they've actually dropped the FSC requirements because their cultural requirements are more stringent. So these trees came from that reservation. They gave their lives to the school. They were brought down in a ceremony, and so when we talk about those trees, we think about them actually existing and holding stories that are pre-European contact even in some of those areas. So the trees were just stripped of their bark and put onto the steel columns that the structure of the building. So you'll see these in a couple of these photographs. This is community, the main space that you enter into, and the theater or drum is right here. Any of the spaces that people come together in, we have these fireplaces. Some of them are very large. We think about the idea or notion that fire is a place of community, place of council, a place where people are coming together. And then the bridge on this side connects to the education wing on this side. The library is up there. The mezzanine is here. The corporate boardroom is up there. So students aren't allowed on the mezzanine. Only adults, elders can come to the school, and there's a lounge up there for them as well. This is the Earth to Sky stair that connects up to the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade from the elementary school grades. Again, we thought of it as a kind of rite of passage, so it is kind of embedded in the building and then emerges through this large expansive window at the top here. That letting light in, because that second story is more about the sky. One of the spaces in the building is called the Place of Nations. They wanted a space that acknowledged the entire U.S., and so I designed this space so that it was a kind of abstracted map of the U.S. Within the space, and creating these areas of seating for large groups, 1 or 2 people, and other sort of groupings of people. So the space is used in different ways. It's used as teachers might have to counsel students one-on-one, so they take them into that space, or teachers might want to leave the classroom and go into the space, or community events are held within that. So the pieces of furniture here that I designed is in the Four Corners area. The Four Corners of the U.S., New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado is a sacred spot for the people that are indigenous to that area, because there are 4 mountains that you can see in the view, and if you stand at the confluence of that, they talk about how that's really where the origins of their earth came from, or their cosmology stories. People emerged out of the earth at that point. So these pieces, the furniture pieces here, they're mountain, mesa, and mound. They nest together. They can come apart. They accommodate different seating positions and postures within that particular space. So they've been a long-time client of mine, the Indian Community School, and so I recently did a project with them for their sweat lodge. They needed a room for people to change in, to change for the sweat lodge ceremony, and then to change back into their street clothes and after the ceremony. So I created this space that I call the Grandfather Stone, which is just a small sort of structure that is lets natural light in through this polycarbonate panel that's in the roof, has a door for privacy, so people just basically kind of go in and change their clothes. But I started to think about, how can I make a thing next to this other ritual that shouldn't be disturbed by that process of having to change your clothes. So I started to think about, what if the thing were almost geological? Could I begin to think about it in that way? And so I came up with this faceted form, kind of based on the stones that were part of the ceremony, which are important, and the stones that are found on the site. So this is an image of one of the stones that's found on the site. So during the excavation of the building, you would find these large stones. They actually kept them on the site, and so they are arranged throughout the site. But But I started to think, what if I could take that surface and form and unfold it or unroll it into a single sort of surface? And so the paper model here is the sort of study for that form. I actually gave the paper model to the contractors, and the contractors used it to build the thing, to kind of figure out how to frame the thing. So it's a really sort of simple structure. It has a 2x sort of framing with a cement board cladding on the exterior, and it's in this sort of dark gray color to kind of match the tone of the stones and to kind of blend into its context. So I did this series of models studies, and so when I talk to my students about these kinds of things, I talk to them in a way that says, well, you know, after you leave school, you don't always have to wait for a project. You don't have to enter a competition or have an assignment. People don't generally do that, right? Like your clients don't give you assignments. So I think it's important to stay nimble when it comes to design. So this is one of the projects that I was working on when I didn't have a lot of commissioned work, and I call it yaw, or bending out of course, right? Yaw is that term that pilots use when the plane is moving out of course in this sort of rotation. And so I worked in a series of models that I basically, some of them started with drawings in my sketchbook, some of them didn't. Some of them are basically three-dimensional sketches, and they're sort of material explorations. But I began to wonder, asking myself a kind of question: what if we don't know who made this thing? Was it a person? Was it an animal? Whatever made it may have a kind of tacit understanding of nature and is trying to blend in with nature in a particular way or manner. And so in each of these, I used wind data that was reconfigured into a form, and those things help inform the forms of these. But each one of them is really has a kind of material palette that is similar to one another. They have these kind of antennae. We're not quite sure whether they communicated with one another. So I'm asking myself these questions, not waiting for the answers in order to represent them or to build them, right? To me, that was an important thing, that I didn't have to figure the whole thing out and then represent it. Too much of I think what we do and how we teach you to think is about like formulating the idea, representing the idea after it's already kind of been figured out, right? But what happens when we're asking those questions as we're making it and designing it? So to me, it was a time for me to stay nimble as a designer, because when a client does come to me for a project, I feel like I can think a little bit more on my feet, as it were, when it comes to these types of projects. And so that kind of thinking will inform another project that I'll show you in a minute. So we've also seen this image, right, in architecture school, Lauger's primitive hut, right? So there's a story about how architecture started. This is the frontispiece of that story. And in the image, the woman is pointing at the architecture, which is supposed to be blending in with nature and demonstrating that. And I oppose that with this vintage photo by Edward Curtis of an indigenous dwelling. The indigenous dwelling is blending into nature, is not really discussed as a building per se or as a design. It is the extension of the culture in a seamless kind of way. And so to me, the fundamental differences between these, or the ways that I begin to think about them, is in the Lauger portrayal, nature is mine, right? I'm pointing at it. Nature is mine to take and to make architecture from. I can take these trees, I can mill them, I can change them into this pedimented structure. And the difference is nature is me in indigenous thought, right? The idea that I'm related to nature and that we use familial names for the stones are our grandfathers, the earth is our mother, the moon is our grandmother. So we understand life as a sort of continuum of, if we began to think about the earth, and I include architecture in that as if we were related to it, we would think about architecture differently, and that nature's role in architecture is significant, and particularly how we put buildings in the landscape. So another thing I worked on during that time was a series of speculative dwellings, or what I call domiciles, that are based on my tribe's moon calendar. So most indigenous cultures, native cultures, have these calendars of moons, and they usually happen around the new moon. And when the new moon comes around, a new thing happens. So usually they're associated with cultural rituals, things you might be doing. So we have the third ones are maple syrup moons. So that's when we do the maple syruping, or we're planting, or harvesting things, or storing food. Those kinds of things are all of the titles. So I began to think about, again, like, what if I were to make a series of structures, or design a series of structures where I wasn't quite sure whether people made these or animals made these. And if I gave myself a series of parameters, which I did in each one of these, how would the architecture begin to manifest itself? Because I started to think, well, if I removed a lot of those other sort of contingencies that go along with building design, maybe I can free myself up in other ways, and I found that to be true. So most of them, all of them actually start in my sketchbook. I draw them all in elevation. So as I'm drawing them in elevation, or drawing them in different ways, I'm also doing a digital model of them. And so I'm incorporating the wind data of these particular times. So the sequence here of the numbers is just the sequence in which I did them. There's no real secret to their connection to this particular sequence. And so in number 1, which is the harvest moon, so some of the parameters I gave myself was they're all going to occupy the same sort of mass. They're all going to have some sort of headdress or regalia. They're all going to have these antennae. They may communicate with one another. There may be some interesting way of getting into the thing. They're all displaced from the ground the same amount, and I'm going to treat how they greet the ground in a very specific way. So in this one, I started to use the wind data from September, and it creates this kind of carapace on the back. This is the digital model, the digital rendering. So I began to think about, too, as well, like, how am I going to render these things? First, the digital models were only there to help me in the way that, like, I would just use the digital model to figure out the shade and shadow on the elevations of this when I began to watercolor it. Another thing you'll notice in these drawings, too, this started when I did my artist in residence for the National Museum of the American Indian. In my sketchbook, I decided that I wasn't going to erase anything, so I never erase anything in a sketchbook. What I do is that when ideas start to get more resolute, things get darker, things get colored in. So you'll see even in this image, there's some notes at the top. There's actually part of a drawing here that was started and not finished in the background here. Some numbers, some other sort of ideas that are on there. I believe that we draw the way that we think, right? And so sometimes when we start thinking, those ideas aren't quite formulated, but I do think that we can modulate that when we begin to represent things in different ways. So this is another one, the maple syrup moon. I translated the wind data into this canopy that creates this a canopy above here. So this one has legs, as if the thing could ambulate or ran to that particular spot that it exists within. And so I started to think about deer's legs, those kinds of things. And in this one, there is a person. In this one, there's a person. In the other one, I started using animals as the scale figures instead of people in each of them. And so as I began to use the digital models, I began to think more about how I was rendering these things, and using those digital tools, how was I going to expand how things could be rendered, right? It wasn't just about reality, it was about another reality, seeing things that we wouldn't normally particularly see or begin to understand. And again, in the digital models, I'm using animals as scale figures. This one, the New Year moon, the wind data is creating this sort of wing that is gathering water, and so I quickly wrote this phrase here. I roll out a cloud to make my own rain, so that the thing is sort of sequesters rainwater and I can pull it out. And then I began to think about things like, what if I made, instead of a series of columns, what if the thing was just built on a series of sticks, right? Like, how dense a thing of sticks would I actually need to begin to hold this thing up, and I'm manipulating the ground a little bit. So they don't have particular sites in any specific environment or place, but I'm beginning to think about how they might inform those. And so this particular drawing won a Cave Rob Prize for the best physical delineation that particular year. This one, number 7. So I'm going to do all 13 moons. I'm on number 9 at the moment. Each of them has drawings like this in my sketchbook. Each of them has digital models and renderings that go along with them, and I'm in the process of actually making physical models of these. So this one, the thunder moon, I started to think, what if I could use the wind data to make a device to hear the thunder? What if I needed to hear the thunder in the middle of the night? So I started to think about the shape of the deer's ear, and then created this rendering where I'm kind of stripping out and not really thinking about the material. This one won the best digital image for the K-Rob in 2013. And again, you'll see that each of these have all of these kind of antennae. On the top, again, we're not quite sure whether these things communicate with one another. They're taking in signals, they're sending signals. We're not sure about those issues. This one, the green car moon, is similar, and the others. This one, I decided that I was going to make this sort of intricate sort of structure at the ground, and the bear here has a relationship. So as I started to do these, I started to write these kind of short narratives, and I'll share one with you for this particular piece. I've planted corn within my mother. I planted each seed by hand, spacing them by walking with a calculated gait. When the corn is in the milky stage, I will play a song with the metal diadem my dwelling wears. Bear waits outside, but I don't want him to know which way I have arrived or will depart. I build the entrance to my home like a cloud. I can at once be within it and see out. I like to play with Bear. He doesn't know if it's me or my shadow that is moving. Eagle plays the same game with him where he drinks. He grows tired and returns home. So what I'm trying to do is not only add a sort of narrative poetic element to each of these, but I'm also taking in other things that are part of my culture and why those things exist in those particular moons. So the reference to the corn in the milky stage is the thing that signals the green corn moon and what the ceremony is at that particular time of the year. So the next project I'd like to share with you is this project that I call Radio Free Alcatraz, an architectural speculation. So this is funded by a grant that I received from my university, a research grant. And so in my proposal, I proposed that I was going to study the American Indian occupation of Alcatraz Island and to create an architectural speculation that is associated with it. So from November of 1969 to June of 1971, Alcatraz Island was occupied by a series of American Indians, a large group of them that grew to 300 or 400 at some point in time. So this is a time when Alcatraz Island was decommissioned as a prison. It was federal property. There was only one person on the island that was a caretaker from the Department of Interior. And so this group of students from the University of San Francisco decided to occupy the island. And they occupied it based on a treaty, the Treaty of Fort Laramie with the Lakota people from the 1800s, stated that the federal government, if the federal government deems any land in surplus, you can have it. So that's why they took it, because it was deemed surplus by the federal government. So this group of people, they set up basically an entire society for this 19 months that the island was occupied. This is an example of one of the ID cards that they issued, and for the most part, they actually negotiated good faith with President Nixon, Governor Reagan, and the U.S. Department of Interior to have the island. Now, they didn't want the island for any political or financial gain. What they wanted the island for was to make a native university, a native cultural center, and a native ecological center. So in my grant proposal and in the project, I'm proposing that I will design the university, the native university, that would occupy the island, and it would coexist with the island today as a national park, is what it is right now. Alcatraz has this interesting history because it wasn't always a prison, right? It was actually had multiple lives. One of the lives that it had was during the Civil War. So if you can imagine, the time frame of the Civil War is the time when they found gold in California. So they were worried about the Confederate Army getting a navy and actually sailing into San Francisco, taking San Francisco and taking the gold. So Alcatraz Island sits in San Francisco Bay and was actually sort of fortification to protect them from that. And those ruins are actually underground in the island today. Another thing it was used for is Navajo people here were brought to be assimilated, right? Their hair was cut, their clothes were taken away, their language was taken away. That was one of the things that happened on this island. The image on the right happened during the occupation. And so there are many interesting things about this particular occupation that I think are worth thinking about. For me, one of them is this idea of the rhetoric of protest, right? Graffiti was actually a very strong and influential thing that happened during this particular event. And so you can see the people that are occupying the island are appropriating these images, right? The eagle, this is my land, and showing you Geronimo. The other thing they did, they changed the signage. So the one on the left said, keep off U.S. property. They changed the U.S. into Indian property. They changed all of the other identifying things on the island. So this graffiti on this side still exists there today for the most part. I think that this sign has changed a little bit, but for the most part, this graffiti is there. So it's a national park, and the National Park Service understands this as being an important part of its history. But this happened all over the island, this graffiti. Anywhere the reference to the U.S. Federal property, those kinds of things were made. The other thing they had was this radio show that John Trudell, who was a native poet and activist, ran. And so the University of San Francisco let him use their airwaves. So he broadcast this like 15 to 20 minute show every night from it, and he called it Radio Free Alcatraz. So that's where the title of my project gets its name. But again, the idea that the graffiti is a way of claiming the territory or is used as a rhetoric of protest is important. And my favorite piece of graffiti is this one on the right. Custer had it coming, right? This is for me, it's a kind of tagline for the project. The graffiti on the left that's on the water tower, again, is important to the history of the island. It was restored, I want to say 5 to 7 years ago by the family of the people who had originally painted it on there. So in this project, I do these series of drawings, and the drawings to me are a way of thinking about the complexities and intricacies of the project. Because I'm not starting with like I'm going to write a program or find a site and put the building here, right? But what I'm trying to do is trying to tap in, demonstrate, recommunicate the things that would have led these people to want to occupy the island. And so these are kind of thematic drawings. So this one is called trajectories. And so I think loosely about the term trajectories. So I'll start with things like the map of the island. I'll project every edge of every building that's on the island. Trajectories of the water traffic from the nautical maps that I found, bathymetry maps, the ways that were used of surveying the coastline before there was GPS, was this really intricate network of triangulation that covered the entire state of California. Air traffic, wind patterns, the sun, even the America's Cup race that was going on at the time in 2013 when I started the project. All of those things are on this kind of drawing. So when I do these kinds of drawings, anything that basically kind of comes to me that relates to that theme gets put on the page, because I'm not trying to parse out those issues or trying to make value assessments on them as I'm representing the thing. I feel like as a designer, we need to allow those things to pass through our cognitive system, come out as a creative thing for us to be able to use them as designers. We can't just like make a note or put it in a file or those kinds of things. So I draw these on Mylar. I usually use several sheets of Mylar. I use colored leads, graphite, image transfers, adhesive transfers, tape, all kinds of things on this. And so the layers that are underneath this one, I'm thinking about the idea of trajectories of assimilation, those kinds of things. So this is a map of the Trail of Tears. So if you can imagine a U.S. map where Florida is here and Georgia is here, these people were marched out of their homeland into Oklahoma at the time, which was called Indian Territory, right? So these people were physically marched out of these their native lands, the places they're indigenous to, the places that they had cultures, entire ways of life that are marched into these areas. The other thing that I'm showing here is the path that my people took from Oneida in New York State. So the united part of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy moved along the Great Lakes to Wisconsin and occupied that territory there. I'm also showing the four mountains of the four corners in that drawing. So I'm trying to see these things all at once. That's why I use this kind of the Mylar process, where I draw on top, I draw on the bottom, I adhere things to the top, I adhere things to the bottom. They kind of work in this sort of layered sieve, sort of visual sieve kind of way. This one is called Territory, so I'm interested in looking at how people are claiming territories, again, kind of going back to that idea that territory was claimed with graffiti. How are territories claimed in other ways, through petroglyphs, hieroglyphs, other sort of glyphic languages, those kinds of things. And so I'm looking at geological maps of the island, vegetation maps of the island, where the buildings actually are, comparing scales of things. And so there's a series of buildings that were here when it was a prison, and most of that was the barracks that the guards and their families actually lived on the island in these structures. And so during the occupation, they were used as housing, and shortly after the occupation, they were kind of demolished so that no one could do that again. Couldn't occupy the island again. But I'm proposing that this university, for 1,491 students, would occupy that southern end of the island. So I'm looking at things like the size of Taos Pueblo, the size of Chaco Canyon to scale with Alcatraz Island. They're about the same size. Those things could fit within that kind of area. So those ideas of settlement. And this other idea that territories and how territories and lands were ceded, I'm looking at where I'm from in Wisconsin, and I'm also looking at South Dakota. So what we're looking at as a mapping here is the original sort of boundary that the federal government gave the Lakota people in South Dakota, and then shrank it down to this size, and shrank it down to this size, and finally to the yellow, which is the federally recognized tribe reservation boundaries. And so this is where Standing Rock is, where the pipeline actually comes through. This is Wisconsin. So when my people moved to Wisconsin, they purchased this land with the Menominee. So they bought the land here, and this much of Wisconsin was purchased. So this is the 1820s, before Wisconsin was a state in 1848. So they purchased this amount of land. Federal government came in and said, no, you can't have that, but you can have this. So we purchased this piece of land. So that land now is paid for twice. And they said, no, you can't have that. And then came in 1838 to establish the federal reservation boundary, and then we purchased that piece of land. So the piece of land that is within our federal boundary at this moment, we've paid for 3 times, but we do not own 100% of it. The Dawes Allotment Act, which you can look up in the late 1800s, gave all the land to all the tribal members, but then said you have to pay tax on that land, something none of these people understood or what it was, and so the government took it back and then would sell it to farmers, those sorts of things. So our reservation is something like 40,000 acres. I think around 1980 we only owned about 2,000 acres. That was the lowest it had ever kind of gotten. It's gone up, but it's not nowhere near 100% at this particular time. So what I'm trying to do in these drawings again is to show you these issues, and this is only scratching the surface of why these people would have occupied these particular places. And so, and I'm also trying to raise awareness and the ideas, historical things in our country, right? So Acoma Pueblo. These are the first cities in the U.S. These are the first multi-story buildings in the U.S. In the Pueblo and Southwest. Chaco Canyon. the first intricate sort of masonry construction in the U.S. If you look at the construction of this particular place, which still exists, was built by the Anasazi, which is a culture that doesn't exist anymore. No one's quite clear where they went, what happened to them. There's certainly speculation about it, but they built these structures basically to not only to live within, but to see themselves in nature. They have very intricate masonry, intricate openings, making lintels out of wood and how to create openings. And there's no way that they had ever seen or had any communication with the Romans or seen what the Romans had done, right? But it's that sophisticated. So I'm trying to raise awareness of that. Petroglyphs, which are these stone carvings in the Southwest. There's a group that has 3D scanned most of these to document them, and so I'm pulling some of those into this drawing. I'm also trying to index things like this, right? So this is the Massacre of Wounded Knee, and that's signified right here with the date, 12/29/1890. So at that time, and this is in South Dakota, Wounded Knee, nearly 300 American Indians were massacred. Of those 300, at least 200 of them were women and children. They did not have weapons. They did not pose any kind of threat. What they were doing, they were dancing, and their leader, Wovoka, told them to keep dancing, that the bullets wouldn't hurt them, and obviously that wasn't the case. So this group of U.S. government soldiers that are all standing here so proudly massacred these people, threw them into the ground. This is an image, and they had the gall to document it through this image, right? So this is the U.S. government's relationship with American Indians. So unfortunately, when something like what happens in Las Vegas, and they say that this is the largest mass gun violence in the U.S., that's not even close to being true. Not even close, right? We got 300 people here, and I can't even begin to list off the number of massacres that are documented by the U.S. government in this. So what I'm trying to do is demonstrate that these things happened, and I have to find a way to represent them, right? So in the drawing, I choose to index it with the date and not necessarily the imagery. I want people to understand what the drawings are about, but I want you to begin to research that and understand that yourself. But to understand that why these people were so angry that they would occupy the island in this manner. This third drawing is called Glyphs, and so it's about how we might think about characters or glyphic language, beginning to think about forms that might be brought forward in that. So things like the Haudenosaunee headdresses. We were a confederacy, and that confederacy is the basis of the U.S. Constitution. There is evidence of Franklin and Jefferson having contact with that, and so if you people have written about this as well. But we were a confederacy, not necessarily a kind of a monarchy, or our leaders were elected. But we were signified by the different configurations of headdress. So my tribe, the Oneida, had 2 feathers up and 1 feather down. So I'm looking at those kinds of things, looking at the island itself and the elevation and how it's sort of been scraped level with several buildings that are laid upon it, and thinking about that like as if it were a battleship sort of thing, right? So this is a mapping of all of the federal reservations in the U.S., and then the purple ones are the top 50 most populated. And if you'll notice the map, we can see the manifest destiny, right? Like the European contact on the East Coast began to push people to the west, but most of the land that's occupied here is rocky, it's hilly, it's hard to farm, it's subject to drought, those kinds of things. And so I look at the other ideas of colonialism, other people who are writing about this. And so a woman who works at the Maori in Australia, New Zealand, wrote this book, and she talks about these terms, the vocabulary of colonialism. And the vocabulary is three things that are used basically in mapping, right? The line, mapping the territory, surveying it. So giving you a boundary and saying that this land, right, it happens here, and this happened in the examples that I showed you. The second thing is the center, the orientation to the system of power, the motherland, the church. All of those things had things to do with American Indian culture. And the third thing is the outside, right? The territory of the people in opposition in relation to the center. Those people outside, these people need to move. Those kinds of things, those kinds of terms, and those kinds of ways of thinking. And so mapping was actually a political way of beginning to do that. And so if I try to appropriate that or decolonize that, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to think about these things. How can I mitigate some of these things that are going on? And the idea that the terra nullius, right, that is the no man's land. So these people were pushed into a zone or area of the U.S. that was no man's land until people kept pushing at it and realizing that these were fertile lands. They had oil on them, they had minerals, they had other sort of things on them. And so that was why these lands were being shrunk smaller and smaller. So when I look at these things, I try to create and look at them through data and look at those 50 reservations through population, the area, and then the function of that, how many people per acre, creating these forms of density. And in that making of form, I begin to think about how could I make form from that, right? So I start to think about, well, if the form or the data is kind of reified into this thing, what if I were the sun? And if the sun sees a form, it doesn't see the shadow, right? It only sees the profile of the thing. So beginning to think about the data itself and different times of day in the particular place that I'm existing in, as if it were a shadow puppet, right? And I'm not quite clear whether or not I'm looking at the shadow or I'm looking at the hands, right? So the animal. So these other forms started to emerge out of that, and I began to think about other things like the Zuni fetish, which are these small things that the Zuni people carve, make these kind of elements that they're basically kind of fit in your hand, or you can put in your pocket. You basically have the kind of spirit of these animals always with you. And so I made these into 3D prints, and they actually help inform the form of the building. And so I'm at this point where, in the process of which that I'm beginning to create these form studies of where it would occupy that southern end of Alcatraz Island. So a native artist friend of mine put this image together, which I really kind of fell in love with because I think that it has many interesting things going on. But one, the definition of to indigenize, bring something under the control, dominance, or influence of the people native to an area. Like you could do that, right? Like you could, it's the process or the agency to indigenize something, along with this operating system thing, right? Where if you press OK, you're undoing the changes forever. So you're indigenizing forever once you hit the button. I love the image for those reasons. And so the last project I'll show you, I'll talk about the Miller Prize project. And so the Miller Prize is the inaugural Miller Prize was put together by a group called Exhibit Columbus in Columbus, Indiana. And so I was one of 10 people that were selected to participate in this process. So the 10 of us were grouped onto 5 sites, architecturally significant sites in Columbus, Indiana. My site is the Saarinen and Saarinen Church, the first Christian church. So designed by Eliel Saarinen and his son, Arrow. Arrow was about 26, 28-ish when they got this commission. So he and his father worked together on the church when they were both at Cranbrook. But this is the first modernist church in the U.S. At that time, no other church kind of looked like this. The Saarinens had very specific ways of thinking about the space. And the church cost over $1 million, which was like completely controversial. So I'll get this quote wrong, but there was an article in Time magazine about the thing that basically said, it wasn't First Christian Church, it was the First Tabernacle Church, but it's the first church in the U.S. Designed by Europe's most famous architect, cost $1 million for a city of 11,000 people. Was really kind of controversial thing in that regard. So when I approached the project, I started to think about, well, how can I say something about indigenous people? How can I say something about the people that are indigenous to this area? So Indiana has this weird sort of history in that it's one of the places that got that history erased very quickly, and it doesn't do a lot to kind of celebrate that. So the image on the right are all the treaties that ceded the land in Indiana. The sort of checkerboard area is Bartholomew County, where Columbus, Indiana is. But after some research, the Miami or Miamia people were the ones that were indigenous to that area. It was a kind of a crossroads from many of these Great Lakes tribes because they started to trade with Europeans in that area. But I decided to kind of focus on the Miami sort of indigenous people in that particular area. So the people of the Great Lakes build wigwams, and that's their traditional dwelling. And the wigwam is something that is kind of pervasive. The Great Lakes, eastern woodlands, even parts of Canada have some version of that. But it basically is a system where a kind of dome-like structure is made out of a frame, usually out of wood, saplings, and then clad with either bark or reed mats. The one on the left is unrolled birch bark that is kind of put together and clad together. So in the Nabokov and Easton book, Native American Architecture, there's this image of a wigwam in process where they stick these sapling poles into the ground, which I love this image because these things have to be at least like 20 feet tall in order to kind of create these dome-like structures. And then they're bent over and then tied together. And so I had students working with me in the research part of this and put together this board that basically talked about how the wigwams are made and pointed out a couple of things that I think are interesting sort of architectural / engineering feats. One is that they're not stuck straight into the ground, but they're stuck in at an angle to resist that tension that is created by bending it over, right? So you can't just simply stick something straight into the ground. The other is that you needed to have a fire within it, so it had to have a smoke hole and a door, right? There has to be that cross ventilation so that the space doesn't completely fill up with smoke. So this was my proposal, that one. So I'm going to try to remember all 10 of us, but I was competing against Howard Yoon. Across the street at the IMP Library was Johnston Markley and IKD. IKD won that site. The Irwin Conference Center, which was the Irwin Bank by Eero Saarinen, was Ball Nogues and Euler Wu won that site. The Cummins headquarters was Plan B architecture and B+U, Baumgarten, Uriu, and Plan B won that site. And the Millrace Park by Van Valkenburg and Stanley Sadowitz is Aranda Lash, and Rachel Hayes and Aranda Lash won that. So our pieces are there. They opened on August 26th. They'll be there till November 26th. So when I talked about the project, I talked about how on the right are these intricate sort of ribbon cutting artifacts that the Miami people do, and how those patterns come from a relationship to nature and observation of nature. So those things might come from seeing feathers on an eagle or seeing scales on a fish, the idea that nature informs that. I started to think about how was I going to communicate with Saarinen on the project. The competition didn't ask us to do that directly. Our competition site for this project was here, basically where all the trees are. So I decided to site the project right here. And so what I did know is that Eliel Saarinen, they had this entire city block that they put the church and the school on, loved the golden section. So everything in that building locks into the golden section. It actually explains why, if you remember the photo, the cross and the door are off-center. So that is where the main worship space is also off-center, ties into this geometry. The position of the tower, its displacement from the building, the size of the courtyard is all there. So I decided to put myself next to that geometrically and in that particular space. So this is the piece called Wikiami, which is a steel rebar structure that is bent, and we had a company that bent the elliptical forms of it. We built it on a wood form, and then the cladding is an expanded steel that's attached to the welded rebar frame. And it finds itself inside this canopy of trees. The trees are very dense except for this corner, which has an opening in it, and the structure sits within that. The top of it acknowledges the fall equinox, so that's the time when actually the maximum amount of light was brought into the space. And so at that time in September, they had a little storytelling event in the Wikiami, which was run by the library across the street. And so I started to think about images like this. The one on the left was from that Nabokov Easton book of a man basically putting together a structure like the wigwam structure, how we tie rebar today, making that connection between how buildings were made traditionally by indigenous people and how they're still being made today. The structure is, and the skin of it is basically a way of understanding, seeing nature, and the steel is bare, so I'm letting it rust and weather to its natural color because it's basically a temporary structure. I don't have to worry about it being there for 100 years, so I decided not to go through all the machinations of keeping that weathering from happening, but to allow it to happen. This is a view from the entry from the east, which was something that is important in native dwelling, that most of the native dwellings you'll see are entered from the east because that's where the sun rises, and you greet the sun, you greet your visitors from the east. And so that's along this garden wall above the elevated courtyard. The lower courtyard, the Saarinen here, right? So this is the church over here, and you come through the pathway here. The interior of it has this black rubber mulch. I wanted you to have a different kind of experience when you step into the thing, so that the way that you feel is a little bit different. The sound quality is a little bit different when you step inside the structure. The top of it has what I call its regalia. I think architecture should have regalia as well, similar to the work that I had previously done. So the models I showed you, the dwellings, this was my sort of opportunity to be able to take that design exploration and kind of make a real thing out of it and begin to think of it in that way. So I like to see this image and think about, well, is the thing communicating with Saarinen? Are we communicating with each other through the tops of our projects in that way? The interior here, the way the panels overlay with one another creates this interesting moire pattern, and so that the way that they were overlapping with each other and the sizes of them. So there's 3 panels, they're different sizes, but they're all the same shape. And as the thing goes from the back to the front, the panels get smaller and denser, just like the feathers on the eagle that get smaller and denser on its chest. So this is a film that Spirit of Space put together for me, and I'll share this with you. Wikiami is sited on First Christian Church, a National Historic Landmark designed by Eero Saarinen and Eliel Saarinen, his father. It's really a significant piece here in Columbus, and so I'm very happy to have Wikiami on the site at First Christian Church. Wikiami is the Miamia word for wigwam, which was a traditional dwelling of the Miami people. So I wanted to address the indigenous people of Indiana, particularly this area. And I wanted to make a structure that addressed how Native people see the world, see nature, see building. So what I tried to do was to look at the original wigwam structure. What are the constituent parts of that? Why did they use those pieces? So it was originally a round sort of structure that they used wood saplings that they put into the ground and then bent over to create a dome sort of shape, and then clad it with mats or bark. So what I tried to do is to look at how those original structures were made, and then to do that in a contemporary way using modern materials. The structure is steel rebar that is welded together, and then the outside is an expanded steel skin to allow some transparency. Sometimes it looks very veil-like. You can see right through it, and then different parts of the day when light is on it, it looks a little bit more opaque. did read some of Eliel Saarinen's writing, and he talks about nature and how architecture can be sympathetic to nature. The trees here make a very dense canopy. With the exception of this one corner, there's a kind of cavity within that canopy, and so that's kind of why the piece actually leans forward a bit. It kind of leans over the walk and to tuck it into the trees and to not really disturb any of the site. We built a wood form on scaffolding that was CNC cut, and then we had a company in Indianapolis bend the rebar in the elliptical shapes for the horizontals, and those were welded together. And I had a great crew of guys from Forcia, which is a local company here, that volunteered their time. They're excellent craftsmen, excellent workers, so they helped develop a system for putting these rings on, welding the verticals together, and to help put the panels on. So, you know, people made this, even though the panels are water jet cut and we parametrically figured them out. Human hands made this thing. That to me, there was a correspondence to how people made buildings and how people are still making buildings today. Yeah, welcome. Thank you.
So we have 20 minutes or so. We can open it up for questions. You got that?
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by it. I really appreciate the way you started off talking about the duck and the generated shed, because that's my responsibility has been that way, and I was wondering how what would be a more genuine way to address the native approach. And I thought it was intriguing to see that the buildings that you did with pre-doc was very different, and it was much more in some ways like a modernist building, but responding to a particular cultural place. I'm wondering if you would, is that really how you feel we should be approaching it, or do you have some other thoughts about using maybe some symbolism from traditional native ideas?
Yeah, I think we have to, or at least I'm careful about how I use the symbolism. I think that what I'm trying to do is to think about the cultural values, why those things became the forms that they did, not the forms themselves, right? Because I feel like as a 21st century architect, that's what I have been trained to do, and how I decide to use my Western architectural education is to interpret or translate those things. Because I feel like if we don't, then we're kind of always in that decorated shed world, right? Where I'm not going to make a giant wigwam for Columbus, Indiana. What I am going to do is to look at how those things were made and then show you how I'm thinking about that to make this particular form. And so when I worked with pre-doc, we didn't really have those kinds of questions about form. We always had questions about values and thinking, and whether the thinking was appropriate. Because we knew as designers that these were the forms that we were going to create. Because we also can't let the forms get in the way of the message, right? That's the other sort of part of it. So to me, that's kind of the decolonizing part of it as well, because I think the line of saying this architecture and native architecture, it's too easy to do that. But if it's all architecture and it's done by indigenous people, that's a different sort of thing. Yeah.
What's going to happen to your installation after the period's up?
Not 100% sure at the moment. The competition works in a way that once it's completed, Exhibit Columbus, which ran the whole thing, they own all of the pieces, and so they kind of get to decide what happens with it. So I've asked them, the church isn't in a hurry to get it off site in November. I'd like it to stay there all winter because I'd love to see it through the winter. It's actually designed, it's basically engineered as a permanent thing because we never knew how long it would be there. But I'd love to see it with snow and ice on it. there are a couple of people that are interested in it, but it's really about them being willing to take it and move it, right? The moving part of it is really tricky. I think that there are only a few ways to be able to do that. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your projects and your stories.
Sure.
I really appreciate that. I also very much appreciate the naming and framing, so the words that I choose to use put me in a particular mindset about the work that I'm doing. And I'm especially curious if we know that native tongues, we're losing languages all around the
Yeah.
world, but certainly in indigenous cultures. And are there certain words that you're aware of from your traditions that are especially poignant maybe for you as an architect, and potentially ones that if we lose those, we lose something special about how we as architects and landscape architects sort of engage the world?
Yeah. So I introduced myself in my language, but I don't speak my language. It was, however, important to me that someone teach me how to do that. So I'm going to answer your question in a sort of roundabout way, but I only do that because I'm not a speaker, which is unfortunate. My grandmother was the last sort of native speaker in our family. If we went to her and said, "Grandma, can you teach us the language?" she would say, "No. I'm not going to teach you the language, you have to live the language," because she had that's how she learned sort of way of looking at it. So specific words, so I try to find those words when I'm working on projects because I think those things are important, especially like in the signage and the way that you describe things, because I think that the native language is one where what is being signified is much greater than the thing, right, or the object or whatever it is. So to me, it's basically a kind of way of thinking that is true of a lot of indigenous North American tribes. And most tribes have a word or phrase that translates into this, and it's the idea of all my relations. It usually translates into something like that everything is related to me. That's kind of what I always go back to and thinking about that, like the materials I would use or how, because then it's not about sustainability or other things like that, because our culture didn't like compartmentalize things like that, but it's me being responsible for the people that are going to use the building or use the site, or how the animals even would exist within that site. So I just finished a project that's kind of almost finished for the Indian Community School, which is a boardwalk in the wetlands. And I made sure that the people who were excavating the wetlands knew that what they're doing is disturbing the habitats of animals, like these are their homes. And that the students in the school went out in a ceremony and basically explained to the animals, we're going to be doing some construction here, but you can come back after we've improved it. And so, but because that's the way the school exists, that's how I think, and I think that the people that work for us who are non-native, that are moving the bulldozers and moving the soil and replanting and all of that other stuff, need to kind of understand that. That ties into this idea of all my relations again, right? Even non-native people are related to me. That's kind of how our culture is. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, to me, I was wondering, because there's another type of indigenous people from Canada,
Mm-hmm.
which is they are kind of within the very more southern part of the country.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering if you guys would just have the same spiritual forms share with each other, or are there any differences between them and each other?
Mm-hmm.
And if so, what kinds of forms or what kinds of spiritual things you guys would have something in common with each other?
Yeah. The answer is yes. And so I'm fortunate at the moment to be a part of the team that is going to be in the Canadian Pavilion of the Venice Biennale. The Canadian team is led by Douglas Cardinal, and the Canadian Council of Arts, which selects the proposals, decided to select all Indigenous architects. And so they asked me to be a part of the team. There's a couple of us from the U.S., and in the proposal, they wrote that we didn't cross the borders crossed us. So people that are indigenous to North America have a lot of similarities to one another. Culturally, this is the continent that we came from, we understand, and have existed within. So even though we may be called different things, Canadians are usually called First Nations, and they don't have reservations, they're called reserves. It's just different terms for basically the same thing. But the worldviews are very similar. I find that we speak a similar language in that way, and when I'm working with these other indigenous designers, we're thinking about the world in a similar way as well. So I think that, and I do think that also, I mean, it's not just it's indigenous people sort of worldwide, wherever they're indigenous to. There's a lot of similarities to the Australian, New Zealand sort of indigenous people as well that exist on the land in a similar way. I haven't had the opportunity to work on any specific projects in Canada, but I think my methodology and way of thinking would be very similar to working with those groups as well. Yeah.
I just want to say that I really appreciate you taking us through your method and you sharing your working drawings with us. And it's one of the things I think that we're trying to work on at the school is to develop a position on critical representation. And I think the way that you describe it as, not necessarily having to have an idea and then draw what that is, but to, develop a process which is clear and all of your work is a progression of what you do, and to use the sort of active representation to ask a question. I'm wondering if you could, speak a little bit about how the kind of question formation through like an abstract drawing translates into like a more tangible form. If there's any advice that you could give to students about that kind of translation between something that's very, very abstract and very, very personal into something very, very physical.
Yeah, I think that, for me, the forms that get generated, the drawings are generative in that sense. Because if I'm going to generate form, I want to be able to do that in an informed way, and again, to try to tap into cognitive parts of my mind that I might not have the controls of, right? And so when I represent things, that's how I'm doing it. It's a different thing than the Robin Evans sort of arrested image where we have the design object and we're trying to represent that thing either through orthographic drawings or doing it through perspective or some other sort of conceptual thing. It's always like we're looking at the thing. I feel like that diagram is a sort of jungle gym that we can run around on, and that the designed object can actually be informed by the representation and not necessarily have to be the thing that we begin to represent. So when I teach it to students, I talk about how when we're drawing these things and where they're coming from, that we're basically kind of making genetic code in a way that when the forms start to get generated out of the drawings, and I have methodologies for doing that, mostly digital, then we can begin to assess those things. Because as designers, it's ultimately what we do, right? We use our own subjectivity to begin to evaluate whether these forms are ones that we like, or they respond or resonate to different issues or things in that way. So I like to use the representation to begin to do that, because I feel like it lifts a lot of the burden of like looking at the blank piece of paper and saying, well, here's all my program, I got to get all of that to fit into this box, and then I just kind of kick that box until I like the way it looks. Well, I don't think it necessarily works like that. I think if we had the form and then we try to fit the program into it, we can do that, right? I think that's a little bit worthwhile challenge than trying to do it the other way around. There are people that are doing that, like Scott Cohen, right? Preston Scott Cohen, who kind of does that sort of thing. But his is very like almost direct from the representation. Even though the way he used to draw all these things by hand, all of that is embedded in the math in the computer now, but it's a similar sort of method.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Can you just talk about how you see the difference between hand drawing and computer-generated drawing in the process?
They're both tools. I do feel like I'm not one of the. I think the hand digital thing is that's like a 20th century argument, right? That's not like we're beyond that. But I do think that there are certain things in the interface of the digital that force our hand in certain ways, right? Like our hand can do things without thinking about commands, for instance, right? There's an interface of doing that. However, I do think that we should allow the digital stuff to do the heavy lifting for us. meaning it's lofting shapes, we're 3D printing from it, we're contouring it, we're CNCing from it, and then we can begin to evaluate those things. I feel like that's where I try to use it. And I also try to use it, like I've shown, just the rendering way that I render, or the way that I try to render digitally. I try to push the software in directions that it may not just be like I'm gonna hit the render button and then print it out and show it to you, sort of thing, right? But I do think we have to be cognizant of that, the interfaces and the differences between those things. Because I think that our brain just is that malleable, right? That our brain can handle both of those things, so why shouldn't we be able to tap into those as designers? Yeah. Yeah.
How did you come about this method? How did you kind of start thinking about drawing to get more ideas from your drawing? Did you have mentors, or did it just kind of like come naturally?
I had some mentors. I had some people too that I admire, like Perry Culper. I think you can certainly see the influence there. And but I think that he and I do things differently, and I don't try to figure out what he does. I just like the way that he does things. Or people like John Hayduck. I mean, you can kind of see that influence as well. One of my mentors too was one of my professors at UVA, Peter Waldman, who, like, I don't know if anyone knows Peter, but he speaks in a way that is almost like, it's not, like you can't have a normal conversation with him almost, especially you can't have a normal desk crit with him. It's almost like Shakespeare, like you have to get on his level to understand what he's talking about, and then once you do, it's just like brilliant. So he would talk to me about things like, he wasn't necessarily like the expert in my culture, but when I did my thesis with him, it was like, wow, I can love the moon, I can understand what people are doing, and just talking about scratching on the ground and putting things in the air, like those kinds of conversations were things that I needed to be exposed to understand that architecture was more than just buildings and landscapes, but to understand that we're existing within a larger sort of continuum of things, had resonance with me and my culture. So I try to look at a lot of things. I also try to evaluate the things that I like, like what is it I like about this person's work, not trying to figure out what they do. Like, I feel like we're like, as professors, we're kind of like magicians teaching other magicians, and so we're also like looking at other magicians. So I don't need to know that there's another girl in the box. I just want to know how you cut her in half, right? Like, how do you get people to believe that that's one girl and not two girls? You know what I mean? That kind of thing is how I like to think about representation. And then you have to make it your own. Like, what am I trying to say with it and what I'm doing? And so that's what I tried to do. And, again, it didn't happen. Like, this issue of, like, not erasing in my sketchbook was a little bit of an existential crisis at one point. I was like, okay, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to erase anything. What would happen if I begin to do that? And that kind of became a thing. So you have to make it your own in that way, too. Yeah.
Just an incidental question for your notebook when you decided you weren't going to erase.
Sure.
So how often did you feel you started over again, or to what extent could you superimpose something new on something old?
Quite a bit. So one of the first things, maybe I should show it when I talk about it, but I started to draw this like section of a turtle, and I just knew it was all wrong, because I wasn't looking at a section of a turtle, right? So I pull up a section of a turtle and I print it out and I'm like, okay, now I'm going to start drawing this. But I decided I wasn't going to erase that bad section. And then that's when I started to realize that thing will almost completely disappear. But at some point, it's still, the going through the exercise of having drawn the bad version is important. And I think we continue to do that through our careers, right? Like, we might do something like, oh, I don't like how I put the base on this room, and then 20 years later, I found a better way to do that. That's what we do all the time as architects, and so I tried to tap into that.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Chris.
Sure. You're welcome.